Welcome back to another episode of the Reformation Red Pill Podcast. I am your host, Joshua Haymes, and I am joined in the studio again with Mr. Pete Hegseth. If you'll give a quick intro for anyone who might be popping in on part 2 of our series.
Well, hope you watched part 1. Joshua, thanks for having me again. Follower of Christ, father of 7, married to my lovely bride, Jennifer. My day job is at the Fox News Channel and have had it where I try to use that platform to glorify God and fight for things that matter. And author of this book with David Goodwin called Battle for the American Mind, which was a discovery for me as a father, and a parent, and thankfully has been impactful for a lot of people in realizing how deep our problem is in K through 12 education and the options that people have.
Which is what we will be getting into today, is the history of that problem. So for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, perhaps, I encourage you to press pause, go back to episode 1 and watch that first, because really we've got a 3-part series going on here. The first part was the depth of the problem in our educational system, and today we're covering the history of the problem, or as you say in the book, the unauthorized history of American education.
That's right.
Which I love that.
By the way, one other thing I'll say in between episodes, don't just hit pause and go back to episode number 1. Hit pause and go back and watch the Reformation Red Pill Podcast.
Come on.
Because I've arrived here at episode 2 as a new fanboy of the podcast.
Oh, nice. I love that.
I realized last time we had this conversation, I know you guys, I know Pastor Brooks, Robert, everybody. I said, I got to watch this stuff. And so I watched an episode a day for the last, 10 days or whatever. It's really good.
Come on.
Great work. Amazingly, just edifying as a Christian who wants to learn and know more recently, sort of still swallowing the Reformed Red Pill. A lot of people are at different places on the journey. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing resource. So I appreciate, I'm a fan. I'm going to watch all the episodes going forward. And if you're watching it now, check it out. You will definitely learn something.
Man, that's huge. I've been so encouraged by the feedback I've gotten, because we didn't know what we're just kind of, we believe this needs to get out. So we're just going to do it, Yep. And the feedback we've gotten has been so stellar from a lot of you viewers out there, and that means a ton coming from you, Pete. So thank you for that. Yeah, so go back, watch all the episodes, and go like, subscribe. And just so you know, we have a Patreon for those of you who want to put your dollars to good use. This is good use, I'm telling you. We've built out the studio in my garage. We've got a lot of projects we want to do. So we've had several people joining our Patreon. Thank you guys so much. But hey, if you don't have the money right now, or you don't want to spend it on that right now, just share it. Share it with a friend. Talk to someone about it. We're very much word of mouth kind of spreading right now. So you guys supporting us in that way is a huge deal. It's free for you. So that's my plug for the Reformation Red Pill Podcast. And we're going to jump in to this week's episode, which, as I said, is going to cover the unauthorized history of American education, part 2 of your book, The Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation. And in preparation for this podcast, this is like time 3 of me reading this book.
Can you hold up that book?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I've never seen a book more well tabbed.
Oh yeah, it's like Gandalf going through the old books, studying
well done.
the ring, just making notes and everything like that. Yeah, I wanted to be very well prepared for the interview.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So that's funny. You weren't trying to plug your book. You were trying to plug my
I'm trying
insanity.
to point. I will tell you this. Any author the thing you appreciate most is when people engage with the content. And so I say that out of a heart of gratitude. Yeah. And same thing for my co-author, David Goodwin. I'm going to see him in a few weeks. This book I want to start every episode without the disclaimer of this book does not happen without him.
Yeah.
It was a full providential partnership. And so I reread a lot of this too, because some of it was newer to me when we were writing it, because it was stuff that David was well steeped in, and we cross-pollinated in a way that was very beneficial, I think.
Man, I love that. So before we actually jump into the content of part 2 of this book, getting into the history of the problem in our education system, I want to remind you of what our goal is for this podcast episode, or for the series, rather. And it is, number 1, that you would understand that our government school system has been one of Satan's greatest tools for excising Christianity from our country. So we want you to understand that we're going to get into the history, and we don't, we don't have, nowhere in the book does it say the devil made him do it, but the devil made him do it. Like that really is. This is anti-Christ, and so that's the first thing. And the second thing is I want you to understand that it is your duty as a parent to give your child a Christian education. Now, some people it just may not be in the cards for sending them to a classical Christian school. I understand that. At this point in my life, my kid, he's not of age yet, but wouldn't have the finances to do that. So my wife and I would make whatever sacrifices necessary to homeschool. We're saving up and doing everything we can right now to send our kids to a classical Christian school. But homeschooling is a great option as well. There's some great curriculum out there. Yeah, and so, but regardless, it's a Christian education that they need. Like you said, we talked about in the first episode, 16,000 hours. That's incredible amount of time to send to someone else that's what they're doing is they're discipling your children, right? That's what education is.
And this middle section is meant to sort of further pound home the reality of the state of government-run schools.
Right.
And you can talk about the progressive politics of it, and we recognize that. But once you dig out the history they don't want you to know, and that's why it's called the unauthorized history of American education, they don't want you to know this. They've intentionally buried it. Once they were successful, like anything else, they covered their tracks.
Yep.
And so that parents wouldn't find out. And good Christians of yesteryear wouldn't even realize that what they were teaching was progressive. And so we try to sort of unearth as much as we can to further make that case. As I said last time too, the first step to recovery is understanding the depth of your problem.
Absolutely.
And we're all guilty of it at some level, except for a precious few who understood this decades ago. Thank God for them.
Thank God for them, yes.
And they're starting our comeback, but it starts with how did they do it?
Yep. Absolutely. So we've got, like I said, to understand that Satan has been using government schools as a way to, indoctrinate children and pull them away from Christianity and from Christ. And then number two, that is your responsibility as Christians to give your children a Christian education. And to not do so, as I said on the last podcast, is tantamount to sin against God. That is your number one responsibility. And the thing is, as I said, and I want to make clear, many people sin out of ignorance. And the hope for this is to give you the information to show you that it is worse than you thought. And it is not a viable solution moving forward to just status quo, leave our kids in the government indoctrination camps. It just cannot be. And so we're in the spreading awareness phase. We get into that in the solution phase, which is really exciting. So that's number two. And number three, I really want to, like I said last week, that I was radicalized by this. And very seriously, people need to know about this. People need to understand this. And I want you to feel that same sense of urgency. If we don't change course, we are in the waning days of the American empire. That's
no
just
doubt.
it. That's just the way it is. And so those are the three things I want to drive home in this episode.
One of the things our founders will say is a republic is not sustainable without people that understand what was educated through classical Christian and Western Christian Pidea. So our founders would look at our education system right now and say, your country is gone. And part of what we'll get into.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll jump right on into the first section of part 2. And chapter 4, you titled The Story of the Progressive Heist. So I guess I'll open it up as kind of an introduction. If you want to give a brief outline, what does that mean, the progressive heist? What was it? Was it the secret undercover co-op kind of thing, or was it out in the open? What was going on?
It was both.
Okay,
a lot of it was out in the open because part of David's phenomenal research on this was diving into the episodes of The New Republic and others where they talked openly that removing God was central. And what we reveal in this chapter is sort of how they did it, and the chapter starts with the idea of a heist, of a precious artifact. And the idea is if you're going to remove God, you need to replace something on that pressure plate. Think of Indiana Jones, that doesn't set off the alarm bell so the bamboo arrows don't come out and kill you as you're trying to steal the precious jewel. And so they very carefully crafted through the use of public schools, and you meet the early apologists or early advocates for it, a sort of a nationalism, a love of state that replaced that. But what you realize about the progressive heist is it's not like it was just a bunch of Democrats or a bunch of liberals who decided to do this. we did it to ourselves as well. So the further you go in, you realize it was complacency of Christians and, frankly, some of the unsure footing even of our founding that created some of the cracks in the foundation.
So how far back? So this whole section is really, we're going to be going through the history of it. How far back when did this heist begin, I guess?
Well, I'm thinking earnest in the middle to late 19th century.
Okay.
You effectively had we talked about the Western Christian Pidea last episode, what that was. So I'm not going to belabor that. Go back and watch that.
Well, maybe just give a quick definition for anyone who refuses to go back and watch.
Distinctively Western, distinctively Christian, and the Pidea is sort of the vision of the good life, or who you believe you are, how you educate your youngest. So it's sort of the waters culturally in which you swim. Who are we?
Right.
What do we value? What are our virtues? And every culture and country has a Pidea that defines them. The Greeks, it's a Greek word that doesn't have a direct translation. But Pidea is usually what's implanted on the heart of our youngest.
Yeah.
And we lived with a Western Christian Pidea for the first 150 years of our country. And so our churches, our education systems, our cultural institutions all more or less reflected that until groups of progressives intentionally started to target it. And that's where you saw the movement of Marx, the movement of Nietzsche, the movement of others, those ideas starting to make their way here. We already had some vulnerabilities to that that go all the way back to the Enlightenment.
Right.
And ideas that our founders were aware of and dabbled in a little bit, which created vulnerabilities for us. But more or less, it's a sort of middle to late 19th century phenomenon.
Yeah. And we'll get into this as we go on in the chapter, but so basically from our founding, and you make this point and we'll get into that, the fact that we were distinctively, like, America is the result. It's the climax of the WCP, of the Western Christian Pidea. However, as you just framed out, which the way you said it is really good, that because the founders were not... they had begun to dabble in the dark arts of Enlightenment thinking. And so there was a mix of Western Christian Pidea and then kind of this Trojan horse of Enlightenment thinking that had gotten in, but hadn't taken over the ethos yet, right? It was ideas that were kind of ruminating, and they were combining with, and they were almost like still on the outskirts and hadn't made it to
Well, you might say that they're elite ideas.
Yeah.
It's just like what you would see in our Ivy Leagues today. There's 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you heard these permeating ideas of critical theory, or permeating ideas of gender as a social construct, or permeating ideas of reparations. And you say, well, that's never going to happen.
Right.
But the elites are chattering about it because eventually they want to push it through the institutions that they control.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those ideas eventually made their way into the elites of our time, of our country. These are things that Jefferson and a number of our founders. I mean, Jefferson had his own Bible.
Yeah,
Jefferson, where he pulled all the divinity of Christ out of it, and took the parts of the gospel that he sort of liked or made sense. And it's not to say that Jefferson's a bad guy. It's just things like Deism became a part of kind of the elite view of Christianity or quasi-Christianity, which then made their way into the thinking of the founding of the country.
Yeah, and we mentioned that that Schaefferian idea. This probably doesn't originate with him, but the kind of the river of ideas where it starts in the philosophy and the Ivy League, and then it flows down into the art and then into the people. So it takes time to go from the elite Ivy League schools, but then however many years later, depending on how accelerated the process is, then it gets down into the general public.
You know, writing this book, I mean, it is such a revelation of my own ignorance, working with David on it, because I went to Princeton. I was a political philosophy major at Princeton. Politics with an emphasis on philosophy. And most of who we studied was Engels and Marx and Hume. And I mean, it was all sort of Enlightenment, progressive. Yeah. It was... And here's the thing. I didn't understand. I was behind one of the philosophers that we studied a lot I can't remember his name at this point. He talked about the veil of ignorance. It was basically everyone was trying to rediscover the golden rule without acknowledging the golden rule.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I just sort of absorbed it for what it was, because I hadn't yet, I didn't believe Marx and all that, but you're just sort of studying it outside the cultural context of Western civilization, because most of that is dismissed or minimized
Right.
through your education. And so when you look back at even the Middle Ages and Christendom and the things that the founders understood about Charlemagne the Great, about Alfred, all of those aren't studied. We don't understand how Christianity coalesced. And then it led to the Scholastic Age.
Right.
All of
Those are the medieval times. Those are the dark ages.
The Scholastic Age, which led to the great universities that were all founded on the pursuit of truth.
Right.
Biblical truth.
Yeah.
Inside the kingdom of Christ. That's the history that we sort of went through for 1,000 years that has been completely dismissed and become the Dark Ages. And that's what we were taught, the Dark Ages.
We were taught the Dark Ages. And this is a great time to pivot into this next section that you go into, which is from kingdom Christianity to humanistic utopia. And the thing that stood out to me as I was reading that was the fact that any captivating worldview, any worldview or religious or religion or philosophy that can capture the masses will inherently have an eschatology. It will be filled out with who are we, why are we here, where are we going, right? What is the end? What is the telos? Where are we going? And this progressive humanistic what did you call it? Basically the progressive version of
humanistic
the Pidea.
Utopia.
Yeah.
Yes.
They have an eschatology.
Absolutely.
Everyone basically has an eschatology, and so why don't you break that down a little bit from kingdom Christianity to humanistic utopia?
On Fox and Friends, oftentimes I will say when we say the date of the show, I'll say February 21st, year of our Lord 2024, and I always get people on Twitter being like, "Oh, you're so why do you say?" Well, for 1,000, 1,500, 1,700 years up until basically the 1800s. That's not just what we said, it's how we viewed ourselves in the kingdom of Christ. Christ was reigning over the world, and that reign of Christ is a reflection of this kingdom. And even inside the words, so the progressives, the humanists, if your religion, if your eschatology is something else, someone else and something else has to reign. Even in the Bible, you see the reign of foreign leaders, the reign of Tiberius. Everything was understood in that they knew that in order to remove the Western Christian Pidea, something else had to reign and be more important. And that's chipping away at that was the start of creating the opportunity for something else.
Right. And so, and we as Christians, because we had Christ reigning, we knew where we were going. We knew that what we were aiming at was Christ being king of the whole world. And full stop, that Christianity goes everywhere. The Great Commission says that he sends his disciples out to make disciples of all nations, to baptize them and to teach them obedience to Jesus' commands. And so that fueled the Christian church to go all over the entire world for centuries and centuries and centuries. And we knew where we were going. It was to disciple the whole world and so we had this eschatological view that essentially was fueling us to bring the kingdom of heaven, as the Lord's Prayer teaches us, on earth as it is in heaven. And that's where we were headed. And that was powerful. But what I noticed and what I thought of when I was reading this was that it was really over the course of the last century, in a big way, that the church kind of took a novel, what's called, and we've talked about this on the couple episodes ago, but a novel view of eschatology, which is the dispensational premillennial view, which had a hyper focus on the fact that they believe the world is getting worse. It's not going to get better. Christ is going to return to essentially chaos, and he's going to rescue his people out of that chaos. So it's kind of this retreatist.
That was a good episode. It's all going to burn.
It's all going to burn.
Yeah.
It's all going to burn.
And if the Marxists have a definitive end, or the humanists have a definitive end here on earth.
Yes.
But our eschatology is it's all going to burn.
Yes.
Then what's the reason for building?
No reason. And I think I cannot stress, I think that the fact that dispensational premillennialism dominated the Western Christian.
When did that start again?
It really started in earnest with Darby's translation of the what is it?
But what ish?
Yeah, it's really started in earnest probably the 30s and the 40s, 1930s, 1940s. It had crept in a little earlier than that, but it really became dispensationalism.
It's sort of fertile ground for the it's not working out so well for us.
Exactly. Well, I mean, you think of, you got the world wars happening,
yeah,
and people going, there's no way the world is getting better, right? It must be getting worse. And so that's whenever the eschatological view that we argue for, which is postmillennialism, almost died out completely during World War I and World War II among theologians. It was like, oh no, this isn't getting better, right? You kind of, that's what I call newspaper eschatology, right? You, instead of looking to Scripture to determine what the outcome of our world is going to be, what our eschatology is, we look at our newspaper and see the chaos and everything in the world and say, no, it couldn't be. So anyway, we formulated in the church this fatalistically negative and pessimistic view of how the world is going to work out. Meanwhile, the progressives are building a fundamentally optimistic, I say that in air quotes, optimistic, because in our view,
absolutely, and they're looking at the religious wars. I mean, you've got to remember the context too. You've got Protestants and Catholics going to war with each other and they're looking at that and saying, well, religion is A, the problem,
right,
and B, it can be an opioid of the masses. So its utility is to temper. And we can build a life here on earth without all that Jesus stuff and kingdom stuff and Christ stuff. And a lot of it for the founders didn't become a rejection of all religion. It became a rejection of the kingdom of Christ and an acceptance of God. The idea that, okay, we'll give you the fact that there's a God out there, but we're not going to fight over the differences of what kind of kingdom Christ is going to establish. So in some ways, it was a retreat historically from a lot of the fault lines that had created friction here on earth, which led to the opening for something like a humanistic utopia or deism.
Man, and I it's just so, you can't redo anything in life, but it's just interesting to think as even a thought experiment, like what would it have been like had American Christians been utterly convinced that it is our duty to disciple this nation and that Christ's kingdom is inevitable. I'm talking about this postmillennial eschatology, that Christ's kingdom is inevitable and we must build and we must disciple this nation, and we've been given a promise, the Holy Spirit, that God's going to be with us, that Christ's going to be with us. Had we not said it's all going to get worse and just fatalistically gone that direction, what would things have looked like?
Well, let me push back on that just a little bit, because put yourself in their shoes. In 1760 or 1770, and in Maryland, you've got the Roman Catholics, and in Pennsylvania, you've got the Quakers, in New England, you've got the Puritans and the Congregational, in the southern states, you've got the Presbyterians. And so they looked around at a very divided set of colonies and said, how do we put this group together? Because this group mostly fled Europe because of persecution.
Religious persecution
in their home countries.
Right.
Now they're here. We realize we either join or die.
Yeah.
If we're going to join, what do we agree on?
What is the unifying principle?
We've been fighting religious wars for centuries and faced religious persecution. So I think it's a fair question to ask.
Absolutely.
But the founders are staring at this gangly group of different states, some of which had official state religions. And they're saying, wow, we got to get them to agree around something.
Right. And so so it used to be in the very earliest days from the Mayflower and the Puritans, it was churches. That was the unifying communal factor.
Absolutely right.
Right. But then we've got this migration happening, right? This immigration on a mass scale, different Protestant denominations coming, different religion, some Catholic, basically everyone Christian. So there's still that Christian ethos in the people.
Absolutely right.
But there is friction because of the different denominations, the different viewpoints. And so you're saying that now the founders are now looking at all of that, looking at that landscape, and they're saying, okay, churches aren't going to be the unifying factor. So what will be?
Well, in many ways, what will be is sort of a passive God and the idea of a New Jerusalem or a
manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny, sort of. And I love the part here that David pulled out. He said, when Benjamin Franklin proposed the first seal of the United States, he wanted an image of Moses bringing the sea upon Pharaoh, or Jefferson wanted the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. The idea is they all saw America as a new order, which is utopian in its underlying assumptions.
True.
Not that the old view was, we live in the city of man, governed by man's institutions, but the authority is of Christ's kingdom, right? The vision of the good life was in our desire as citizens to live to the glory of God and his kingdom. And you had kind of this utopian deist view that we had a new land and a new nation and a new opportunity that was more or less Christian in its general thrust and did manifest in individual freedom and individual liberties and religious freedom, but wasn't they argued no longer needed a Christian kingdom or the symbol of a cross, but a new order under a generic God vested in a nation based on new ideas. So it became more about a nation on earth, which bestowed freedoms and protected those freedoms from a tyrannical king, as opposed to a nation that reflected the truth of a kingdom. And those are subtle differences. We look back in school and we say, hey, our founders were mostly Christians. I mean, how many times have you read, you read books by David Barton or others who are wonderful and they make an amazing case about the Christian roots of our country. They also acknowledge a lot of the tensions here that are there. And so you can oversimplify by saying America was simply a Christian nation and here's how it worked.
Right.
There were conflicts there too. And what we argue is not that everything about the founding of America was a poison tree, but that there were the seeds there for the openings of another agenda. The Trojan horse
was there.
The Trojan horse was there. Some of it out of utility of the founders who realized they couldn't do maybe precisely what they wanted. Your Patrick Henrys and your John Jays and your Samuel Adams, your stout Christians who also recognized, okay, we're getting what we can, but the flicker of progressive thought was there.
Yeah. So in that section that you were just quoting, deism foreshadowed progressivism. How would you make that connection? Because like you're saying, it's so easy to think that it's so easy to fall into that trap of simplicity, black and white answers, right? Where it's like on Twitter, this is what it looks like. Our nation was a Christian nation. No, they were all deists, like back and forth. And so, how would you make that connection between how was deism like a foreshadowing of the progressive?
They weren't all deists. They were mostly Christians. Mostly Bible-believing, Christ-centered Christians from different denominations who believed that. Now there were, but the problem with deism is it was as much a sort of ideological view as it was as a Christian view. So with deism, what oftentimes you're challenging is the divinity of Christ, the authority of Scripture. That's what you see from the Jeffersonian views. Like, I like the general thrust of Jesus,
right?
And what he's a wonderful teacher, prophet, but certainly not God on earth, or the triune God, or all of these things. We can set all that aside and agree mostly on what Jesus has to say, and then learn from the sins of Europe and try to create a governing system that protects the religious freedom of individuals, regardless of what they believe, to include deists. So it becomes this ideological catch-all view that means what it says is Christianity, properly understood, has a place here, lives here, is central to who America is, but not just that.
Right.
Not just that. There's room for really anything, which makes its way all the way now to the Iowa State Capitol of a Satan statue, where the guy that knocks it over is now being charged
of a hate crime.
Of a hate crime.
A hate crime.
I'm not drawing that direct line, but the idea is this is an umbrella of religious freedom, and certainly that is a very different environment, much more Christian, Western Christian then. But it's that flicker that we're talking about that creates an opportunity for the passive God to be filled with other beliefs other than what's biblical.
Well, so then moving on to the next little section here on the early phases of this progressive heist. Progressives make school mandatory. That was pretty enlightening. Beginning with that journey, we've got, you mentioned the guy Horace Mann. Father, in fact, I'll let you just explain that a little bit. What was that? How was that a part of the progressive heist?
He's a father of. He would argue. Horace Mann and his devotees would say, well, his view wasn't decidedly progressive. I think it's probably fair to say he wasn't necessarily ideologically completely progressive. Wait for John Dewey to show up for a lot of that agenda to arrive. This was a nationalistic purposes for man. He's looking around at the country saying we're a nation, but we're disparate. And I want to create and there's certain churches that do it well and certain that don't. But I want to create a national school system and school districts out of the German system. You get the word kindergarten from man's German, a child's garden.
Right.
And so there was you're also moving into the industrial age. You're moving into a different age. And so there's a utility that he and Dewey argue for this type of education. But this is also the incubation of the Enlightenment. So you've got Kant and Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche and all these other views ruminating in Germany. And a guy like Mann says, well, we should be doing that here. It's always what it is. Why aren't we doing it here? We're these backwoods rubes here in America. There's an opportunity to introduce a lot of this, and you can't introduce it unless you create that system. And by the way, education wasn't mandatory. There's the idea of compulsory education laws was a progressive view because most families were educated their kids either in the home or through the church.
Yeah.
And once you start making things compulsory, what happens? The state takes over. Right. Which was the goal of Mann and the goal of Dewey, is to pull it out of the sort of the understood responsibility of churches. And because some kids are falling through the cracks and make it mandatory. And then when you make it mandatory, you can assert the arm of the state.
Absolutely.
And so then states start to say, well, we need to form schools and school districts in order to make sure every kid is funded or every kid is educated, and the system sort of starts building momentum that way.
And I mean, this is the seedlings of government tyranny in tiny format, in little seedling form, right? Because as we talked about last episode, the way God has ordered the world, he's ordered the world with, and we talked about the doctrine of sphere sovereignty. We've got these three spheres of authority that God has ordered the world with. The state, he has ordered the world in such a way that the state really does have authorities, particularly the authority of the sword to execute justice on evildoers, right? And its tool that God has given, Romans 13, is a sword. So basically everything the government does is at sword point. Now we would say at gunpoint. Everything that is made compulsory, if you reject enough times, you are at gunpoint behind whatever. You know what I mean? And what Mann and Dewey are attempting to do, though they may have not put it this way, is they want to inflate that sphere of the state to encompass all the rest.
No doubt.
So we as Christians say there's these three spheres that they touch, they overlap in little places here and there, but by and large, the authority of the home is given to the father, the authority of the church is given to the elders, and the authority of the state is given to the civil magistrates.
Yes.
And we as Christians say, along with Kuyper, Abraham Kuyper, that incredible quote that gets quoted a lot, but there's not a square inch of the entire universe but that which Christ does not cry mine, right? Yep. And so we believe Christ is over all three spheres, but what these guys want is that state sphere to inflate and to the point where it takes over the other ones, and then they don't want to acknowledge Christ. They can acknowledge a deistic God, but they don't want the Christ and his word.
Absolutely. At first, though, they knew they couldn't do that.
Right.
And that's why conservatives still to this day say, well, education is a local, state and local function. Yes, the idea is that it was supposed to be state and local. Of course, that's all since gone. I mean, you can have a slightly different school board, but back in when this first started, local school boards did have control. And by the way, the Bible was freely taught. And that's why we put it in italics here on this page. Until the past century, meaning the past 100 years, the Holy Bible was freely taught in American schools. And that's why we put that in italics in this book.
Yeah.
The idea of the Bible being in a public school, a lawmaker in Mississippi just dropped a bill that I don't know where it'll go, but that mandated a Bible mandated a Bible in every public schoolroom in Mississippi. I love it. We'll see where it goes. The idea of a bill that would mandate the Bible 100 years ago would have been mind-blowing. Yeah. Because 100 years ago, it's how kids learn to read in most schools, publicly funded schools in America. So it's not as if this is a system we've totally flipped on its head, and it started with the small stuff of, well, it's compulsory. And then the schoolmasters supplanted the church and the parents, to your point. The schoolmasters said, well, we're taking control, and the churches backed out. And eventually the church got out of the school business, and the church got into the Sunday school business.
That's right.
And the left said, bingo, now we got them right where we want them.
We got your kids 5 days, you get them one day.
Exactly.
That's a deal.
But it starts with the utility of it. We need the utility of more influence so that no kids fall through the crack, and there's this new education, and the Bible doesn't quite cut it, and there's new philosophies from Europe. It's always these sort of seemingly good ideas or good intentions that once they take root, other agendas pop up.
Right. What struck me as I was reading through that section was that this guy, Horace Mann, succeeded in making public school mandatory in Massachusetts in 1852. And to me, I was like, this battle has been raging for nigh on 170 years.
You wonder why Massachusetts is so nutty. They had a head start on the rest of us.
They had a head start. And so we'll move on to this next section here on page 75 with the Progressive School Project builds a God-free Pidea. So that's what they're aiming at, right? They know there's a WCP. They know there's a Western Christian Pidea. And so we'll say the elites know that, and they don't want that. They want to build their Christless, humanistic utopia that is unbound and unfettered from the truth of God's word.
Yep.
And so now they're actively attempting to build a God-free Pidea. So what does that look like? It starts like we said with the mandatory public schools. What's next on the agenda, as it were?
Well, you need your symbols, right? So if you're going to take the cross and the Bible out of government schools or out of schools in America, and you're creating this heist, you have to replace them with something else. And the example that this blew my mind when we were doing the example we cite here amongst others is the Pledge of Allegiance. We think of the Pledge of, when I talked in one of my books 5 years ago, I said, you get the pledge in your school, get the pledge in your, and you realize what a superficial answer that is to all the problems. And in actuality, it's playing right into the hands of the progressives because the original Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy. He was a socialist minister. And his view was to create a pledge that would create a more nationalistic, state-based reverence in our country. We think of the pledge in Under God. The original pledge did not include Under God. That was added by Eisenhower in the 50s. And the idea was instead of the Lord's Prayer and the Bible and a cross, you had a new secular pledge and a flag, things that Americans could agree on because, we're proud of our country. We're proud of our founding. We haven't yet decided it's a bad place. But it's an intentional project to insert these. The original Bellamy salute had a very unfortunate salute too. It was the Roman salute. They're rooted in history, which looked exactly like the Nazi salute.
Yeah, well, I would show you here, but we'd have to blur it out. We'd have to blur it out.
Yeah, not doing it. But so after World War II, they changed the salute to the hand over the heart because it was untenable. But the idea, it was, again, rooted in history a little bit, but meant to create allegiance to the state.
And that's what they're trying to do, right? We talked just a second ago about how all these immigrants from different Christian backgrounds are immigrating to the United States, and the leaders are trying to figure out what is the unifying thread that gets them all together. And
that's a utilitarian function to the whole thing too.
Exactly.
I mean, a historian would argue to say, well, just like the founders were trying to bring together different churches, how do you bring together all these new immigrant groups that are coming to America, some of which are not Christian, many of which don't speak the language? And so they would say, well, a practical, and that's a lot of what a Dewey would argue, is let's bring in the immigrants, assimilate them to American nationalism. This whole Christianity thing might be something that's nice to do at your church and at home, but here in the school, we coalesce around America. And then we get you a good paying job so you can be a part of the American experiment. And so at this point, you're not really seeding any agendas.
Yeah.
You're using utilitarian reasons or basic economic reasons that are, music to the ears of parents that want that opportunity for kids.
Yeah.
Later on, you slip the agenda in.
What's crazy to me as I think about that is how that maps, like how the progressives' plan from 100, 150 years ago maps onto it today with the same sort of view towards immigration, which is get as many people here from distinctly non-Christian or non-American backgrounds, get them here, don't require them to assimilate at all, right? And then that way we can, they're still doing that. They're trying to create their, and we get into it later in the chapter, but their progressive values as our unifying factor rather than Christianity.
Well, one thing I'll add to that, though, at this moment, at this turn of the century moment, the progressives look really reasonable. Mm-hmm. They don't look radical because there are literal Marxists and literal communists and literal anarchists. You know,
those are all blended together today.
Yeah, they're blowing things up. They're assassinating people.
Yeah.
And so the progressives are like, oh, we're this, more moderate group. We love the country. Uh-huh. We've got flags and anthems and all of these things. And we're building this school system that will support the future of a country. And frankly, they would say that assimilates Americans. I think, we did cultural assimilation 100 years ago. For a while.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Speak English, learn the basics, salute the flag. You're an American.
Yep. Which it's almost like looking back, it makes you wonder. Doug Wilson mentions this in his book, Mere Christendom. Mm-hmm. And he argues, and I think from a Christian perspective, I don't see a strong argument against it, that we really missed the opportunity at the very beginning with not having not making it our country distinctly Christian in the documents, like saying if we had a unifying, because it was so assumed by the founders that, what is it, James Madison, that our country doesn't work apart from a religious.
We've got
Christian
3 pages
people.
worth of quotes that point out our founding generation pointing precisely to that.
Yeah, exactly. And so it almost seems like Christianity was just so embedded in the ethos of the American people that it's almost like it went without saying. But it's like now we look back and go, man, would it be great to have the Apostles' Creed or like something like that in the at least the most basic. The Apostles' Creed, one of the most basic, foundational, orthodox Christian creeds that says like, hey, we should have put in writing from the beginning that this was Christian.
That's why the Declaration of Independence to me is so important, because at least there is that overt references to, rights endowed by a creator. Right. There's rights and nature's God and all of those aspects of the Declaration. What the leftist tries to do in this book and elsewhere is divorce the Declaration from the Constitution. Right. So that the Constitution is purely a secular document, and ignore the ethos of the Declaration, which is we know exactly what God's place is in all of this.
Yes.
And we fought an entire revolution based on this document. So for you to assume that the Constitution means God's out, you're the one deciding to misread what this founding was about.
It's just to me, it's so obvious, like the play that's being run with that, that you've got that's what's so frustrating is you're calling this the unauthorized history. It really is. We've been given this, like you say in the book, history is written by the victors, and the progressive have been winning for the last century. So they're telling the history the way they want to tell it. And
every single part of the history from the way they want to tell it.
Yeah.
And this is it was biased 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now it's out of control. So what you're seeing now is every white kid in class is inherently an oppressor and needs to abide, basically beg forgiveness for their guilt.
Yeah. 50 years ago, it was lies. Now it's insane.
Yeah. But you have to understand the lies to get a sense of how the insanity came about. Mm-hmm. And then you start to realize, well, that's why these institutions in many places are completely irredeemable.
Right.
You're not going to walk into a social studies class in your local public school and turn it all around because you're a conservative Republican with maybe a little different point of view. Tell that to the guy that wrote the curriculum. You know what I mean? It's all part of 100-year process that leads us to today. And one other thing from this chapter that I think is the story about Prohibition. And
I was just going to get to that.
Okay, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Because that was incredibly important. That stood out like a buzzing red light to me. So go ahead and
there's two Francis in this. There's Frances Bellamy, who did the Pledge of Allegiance, and then Frances Willard. She was a suffragette and women's rights, women's temperance movement. hated alcohol and the consumption of alcohol and drunkenness, which is fine. Ultimately, but this was a country not founded on, but like the consumption of alcohol was a pretty normal thing across the country. Everyone accepted it. A bunch of Irish Catholics, no one's given that up.
Yeah.
She instilled a third grade curriculum in the 1870s across classrooms across America. And what happened, it was a very explicit anti-alcohol curriculum starting in third grade in the 1870s. And what happened 40 years ago, a generation later, you had a constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale and consumption of alcohol, prohibition. Prohibition didn't pop out of nowhere.
Right.
It was the direct result of a education system that pushed a particular point of view that led to a cultural change and a political outcome.
Man.
And the progressives studied that and said, so one woman or a network of people with that view and one piece of curriculum changed the entire trajectory of a nation's view on an issue. And they wrote openly in the New Republic about the efficacy of this effort, and that it's the quote that David uses is the plasticity of the child. Like you can mold the kid through what you teach, and eventually you get a different form of voter.
Yes,
that was their goal.
That's Pidea. That's
Pidea. That's why they went to third grade,
reshaping their affections.
Good luck telling a 16-year-old who's already had their first beer.
Yeah, that's right.
You tell the third grader that of all the things you should stop doing, it's your mom and your dad when they drink are bad, and if you drink, you're bad, and if anybody does it, they're bad, and you repeat that enough, and they might be right at some level, but you repeat that enough, and you don't only get shaming, you get a constitutional amendment that changes the way that you operate.
And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, that the left right now is screaming in rage about the fact that we want to get books like Genderqueer and All Boys Aren't Blue out of schools, because they know that if they can get those books to your children, they can shape them.
No doubt.
They can transform them in a very literal sense.
And
now,
you know why she was able to do it so effectively is because there was a newly installed common curriculum. And you wonder why that's always the obsession of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
We need a common curriculum because when states and localities have the options, you can't...
to think for themselves.
Yes, you can't push one agenda. But when the common core is there, you can, boom, straight from the mind of Washington, D.C. into the classroom of your kids.
Man.
It's scary.
Yeah. That is scary. But what that speaks to is the fact that while American Christians were kind of living in this defeatist mentality, the progressives were thinking generationally.
Yeah.
Like they were being patient. They were being committed to their utopian vision, their eschatological view, and they were watching it work out. There was I don't think I brought this up last episode. There's a talk by Toby Sumter called, maybe I did bring this up last episode, but it was this talk. He titled it "Stop Giving Your Strength to Women," and it was from Proverbs 31. But he laid out how they've been on this trajectory to deconstruct American Christianity, to deconstruct the American family unit, and to replace that with an allegiance to the state and the allegiance to community. This neo-Marxist, communistic virus has been present going all the way back to the early 1900s, but really took full force in the 1960s. And so they committed to it, to the long march through the institutions, right? They said, we know how to do this. We first infiltrate higher education, then we infiltrate lower education. They'd already infiltrated lower education at that point, but then we go hard after lower education, which they've ramped up in the last 20 years. And so because they're thinking generationally, that's why we are where we're at right now. While Christians were just running up the credit cards waiting for Jesus to come back next Thursday.
Yes, and they did it with things we still revere to this day. The flag and the pledge. I mean, that's the biggest thing that rocked me as someone who, I wrote an entire book called American Crusade, which its working title before that was American Nationalism. It was basically this civic religion view that like America was special. We keep it special. We keep it strong. We keep it robust. We maintain its traditions. Of course, God is there, but it was centered on American nationalism.
Yeah.
That's because I'm a product of the system that held America up like America was God.
And you're like, uh-oh.
You're like, uh-oh. And listen, I love America.
Yeah.
It's my home and I will defend it.
Yeah.
But when you hold up a nation as if a nation is God, you have it completely upside down.
Yeah.
That's what the progressives wanted from the beginning. I mean, we revered Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was civil religion. We revere these things. They're civil religion. And we appreciate them for what they are, but it was a tool. The pledge was a progressive tool.
Oh my gosh.
The flag in front of the classroom was a progressive tool. And now we define a good school by, do they say the pledge?
Man, you're right.
I mean, it is a mind bender, and it was for me. But once you see it, like we said, you can't unsee it. And it doesn't mean you can't be a patriot. Right. It just means you need to be properly ordered.
Get your affections ordered rightly.
Get your affections ordered rightly, because right now, America is our highest affection in a lot of places.
In the conservative circles especially.
In conservative circles especially.
Mm-hmm. And Jesus is like the lucky rabbit's foot to our American.
I love that way of putting it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how the progressives want it. Because you can drive a truck through patriotism. Yeah. But you can't drive a truck through Jesus Christ.
Woo, come on.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So that's the whole thing moves in that direction,
man,
which is scary.
Yeah, it's funny. You're writing American Crusade, and John Dewey is just sitting there wringing his hands going, ha,
loving it. If you write the book, I'm writing this book for my kids. It's like my manifesto of what I believe.
Yeah,
and then I'm like, oh, I only got 70% of it right.
Yeah.
Kids, I'm going to need an annex to this book.
That's good. And you got one.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Okay, let's move along to this next part here with education in the Western Christian Pidea. You said is replaced with vocational training. So let me
let me quote C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, please.
Who in 1939 wrote, "Education is essentially for freemen, for free men, and vocational training for slaves. If education is beaten by training, civilization dies." So there's education and there's training.
Yeah.
And what do we? I mean, and let's take the modern equivalent to bring it to people's. STEM is a great modern example of that. Science, technology, engineering, and math, which we now want to be called STEAM. So they want to add arts in there because the artists feel left out. There's always a new acronym, right?
Always a new color to the flag.
Never stops. That's why they're successful. Never stops.
Yeah.
But that's the modern equivalent of the vocational training that Dewey wanted to push. Why are we teaching this Latin stuff, this Bible stuff, this English literature, theology? The Greeks?
What are they going to use that?
What does a welder need to know that for? Right. And we're in the industrialized economy. We need to train skills. And in order to train skills, you have classrooms with rows of desks, the Prussian model. And you've got a fixed curriculum, and it's based on the things the experts tell us we need to know in order to be prepared for the future economy, except we never know what the future is going to be. So it's always wrong, or we're always readjusting. But that was and that remains the progressive zeitgeist today, that vocational training is, and what C.S. Lewis would argue, what we would argue is, of course we need welders, but we need our wise welders.
Yes.
What we need is free-thinking welders, just like we need free thinkers. And education is the cultivation of what is good and right and true and beautiful and wise, answering the bigger questions. Yep. Where are we in that hierarchy? What is our relationship to God and our and His created kingdom? And Dewey wanted nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Just teach the training and then give them a job.
Man, I'll tell you, that transformed me in college whenever I started reading the great books, whenever I started taking my philosophy. I went to a Christian college, so I had some really good professors that put some really good material in front of me that had me kind of thinking through this. And I remember thinking to myself so many times, why I wondered why it seemed like my high school education was totally useless. Like by the time I thought that so many times. I can remember thinking to myself, like, did I learn a thing? Like I can't remember learning a thing. You know, it was just like teachers just, all right, pass the grade. You know, coach. You know, whatever. Coach whatever of geometry is like, okay, just do the thing, pass the grade, do whatever. And I remember I made it through. I was like a B student, BC student, ABC. I was an ABC student. All right, that's Maze, in gym,
In gym, yes.
But I made it all the way through high school. Didn't fail out. And I couldn't remember learning a thing. Then I get to college, and then I really start following Christ, and all of a sudden, my mind is just blown open with reading great works of literature and philosophy and logic. I mentioned that on the last episode. How I took my logic class, and I was just like, "Why was I not taught this? Who failed me here?" And it goes back a century or more.
Why would you take logic? You need to learn to type.
You need to learn to type.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, home ec is another. I mean, home ec is like shop class. All of those things are great. Shop class is actually a lot more useful, but something like home ec. I remember taking home ec in junior high, like learning how to write a check and learning how to bake. It's like, well, those used to be things that we learned
from your dad
at home, from my mom or my dad. Yeah. Now the state is saying, no, we need to teach you these.
We're
tools.
Mom and dad.
We're mom and dad now.
That's right. That's right.
Hello there, faithful viewer / listener of the Reformation Red Pill Podcast. This conversation with Pete, where we outline the history of the progressive takeover of the American education system, ended up being about a 2-hour-long conversation. So we here at the Reformation Red Pill Podcast decided to split it up into 2 episodes. So if you want to catch the last half of the conversation with Pete and I, you're just going to have to tune in next week. And with that, dear brothers and sisters, I leave you with our weekly charge. May you build, defend, and expand the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ.